darkness of Mammoth Cave in Kentucky is for sure an unusual venue for a classical concert. And the reason for this event in 2008 is not less unusual. This evening, Klaus Kaemper and Janet Bass-Smith honor with their music the anniversary of a piece of paper. The centennial of the Kaemper map, surveyed and drawn by the German engineer Max Kaemper in 1908. The map is one of the most amazing documents in the history of cave science. About 35 miles of subterranean passages are mapped in stunning accuracy. A milestone in the history of cave cartography, decades ahead of its time. More than a half a century, the map rested unnoticed in some files like a sleeping beauty until it was discovered by chance.
Max Kaemper was an unknown. Nobody had heard of him. The map was found by Jim Quinlan, who was the hydrologist for the national park. And he was rummaging through the files in the office and came across this map, which stunned him. It was by Max Kaemper. He had never heard of Max Kaemper before. The map had been unknown, basically hidden in the files.
For the Cave Research Foundation, whose exploration field was just around the corner in Flint Ridge, the discovery of the map came right on cue.
Cave Research Foundation was quite active in the area, and they were suddenly becoming very concerned about Mammoth Cave because they realized that there was a connection that was about to be made between Flint Ridge, basically their cave, and Mammoth Cave, which nobody really knew anything about except for the tour routes. And suddenly this map appears. And the nice thing about the map is that it showed Echo River, the lowest level in Mammoth Cave, which is a real river, with a little passage going off to the side. And the chief cartographer of the Cave Research Foundation made it his priority to make the connection. So he and his team went in and checked every single lead going in that direction. And he had, on the Kaemper map, located possible places for the connection to be made. And one of those, in fact, it may have been the main choice, was the actual connection.
The Kaemper map was not the first survey of Mammoth Cave. When Max Kaemper showed up at the cave, there existed already several maps, but they all were either very imprecise or showed only small parts of the huge cave system, just in contrast to the Kaemper map.
It was the most complete map, as well as the most accurate map. It was very close to modern standards, which surprised people, because at that time, mapping a cave meant pacing around and maybe a compass in your hand, just figuring out what direction the passage was going.
Even after its rediscovery, the Kaemper map was kept in the archives under tight wraps. Only a few people could see the original, but the Cave Research Foundation could at least get the permission to publish a hand-drawn copy, which henceforth was available for research and as a tourist souvenir for the visitors of the cave.
Max Kaemper's maps served as a focal point for a lot of the caving and hydrologic studies. Meanwhile, nobody knew anything about Max Kaemper. And so there was this big search for who he was and what his background was, what happened to him.
2 more decades passed in which Max Kaemper stayed sort of a phantom until a new generation of cave enthusiasts took the matter into its own hands.
Well, the first time I saw the Max Kaemper map was back when I started working at Mammoth Cave in 1990. And I can still remember the first time I saw it, and even when I look at it today, what jumped out back then and still does today is the beauty of the map. It's just so aesthetically pleasing. The colors, all the different features, the place names, the lettering, the arrangement, just everything about that map is just a work of artistic beauty. One thing that always impressed me, especially from those early days, is the fact that Kaemper did all that work with only one entrance. And when you think about how do I get to this remote location on this end of the map when the entrance is all the way over here, and it's like a maze, a puzzle to wind through the cave and all the different colored passageways, and some go over the top of each other but they don't connect. And you think about the the labyrinth of passageways to make these discoveries and then to map the cave always was very impressive. About 1992, I started to guide the Wild Cave Tour, and it's about a 5 to 6 mile crawling tour. It takes about 6 to 6.5 hours, and we take 14 people through the cave with helmets and lights and knee pads, and we're trying to give them that experience of what it is like to go caving, to go exploring. And when we would come out of the Wild Cave Tour at the end of the trip, usually the visitors would want to know where they had been. And so we always kept a copy of the Max Kaemper map, and then the visitors would run to the bookstore and they would buy a copy, and then the guides who led the tour would get our highlighters out and we would show them the route that we took, and going to Cathedral Domes and Hawkins Pass and all these great features, and sometimes they would like us to autograph their map so they would have a souvenir of where they had been. So as a guide leading that tour, I was very curious and interested to know as much of the history about these areas as I could, because we were going through places such as Becky's Alley and Lida's Pass, and the visitors would ask, what's the story? Who are these ladies? Why is it named after them? And really, we did not know.
Chuck kept on the matter, and he began researching, which led him deeper and deeper into the past of Mammoth Cave.
I started noticing on the walls of the cave signatures, and sometimes I would find Kaemper and Ed Bishop's signature from the 1908 trip, and several times I would find names of people that were with them. So in Martell Avenue, there's a beautiful wall that has several inscriptions, and I could see the names of Beck Wilkins, Lida Flanagan, M.K. for Max Kaemper, and Bishop. And it was clearly from June of 1908. It even said Bowling Green, Kentucky. So really the story of Becky and Lida, especially Lida, was really my first true endeavor to do some detailed research to try to find who these people were. A couple things I had going in my favor. One, the last name Flanagan was very unique, and so I thought that name would show up easier than Wilkins. So I ended up at the museum, the library at Western Kentucky University in Bowling Green, Kentucky. They have great resources. I could do searches for death certificates. They had microfilm with the newspapers from the area. And so I started to research Lida Flanagan. I found out when she died. And then I found her obituary on the microfilm in the library. And I don't know if I've ever told this part of the story, but this was my first time with success like this. And when I found her obituary, and it had some details about her family and her sisters and her life, I was so excited. I jumped up, and there was a lady next to me doing research. I didn't even know her, and I immediately brought her over to show her this and told the whole story to her. And I think she humored me and said, "Well, that's great, that's great." And then she went back to her station. So almost like I could not contain myself. But through research like that, I was able to then track down her sisters, because Lida had never married, did not have any children. So it was a success that I had found her obituary and knew more about her, but the research needed to continue. So then I began to track down her sisters and found their obituaries, and then found their descendants. And at that point, this is in the mid-1990s, I did not have a computer. I didn't own a computer until maybe 2000, so I used directory assistance. I'm on the telephone. I'm making phone calls just randomly to these cities, trying to see if anyone is connected with Lida Flanagan. And eventually, I was able to get on the telephone a lady named Mary Gaylord de Huzar, who was the niece of Lida Flanagan. And she was so excited when I got her on the phone. She said that Lida was her favorite aunt, that she had all kinds of photographs and memories and stories that she wanted to share. But she had no idea that there was a place in Mammoth Cave called Lida's Pass, and that her aunt had gone exploring with Max Kaemper and Ed Bishop. So as much information and photos that I eventually would get from the research, I think Mary received even more to make a connection with someone who had been long gone for quite a while. I remember Mary came to one of our science conferences, and she received a standing round of applause when she was introduced, and she had wonderful stories to share about her aunt. Apparently Lida was a real looker, you know, beautiful blonde hair, and just you know, just the nicest lady. And as you will see, there is a trend with Max Kaemper going through the cave, escorting beautiful young women. You know, so kudos to Max Kaemper.
Chuck's next target was Beck Wilkins. He found out that Rebecca was the daughter of a business partner of the cave owners.
It was very rewarding because we could finally put a face. We could put a story to this one part of Mammoth Cave, and we could tell the story of Becky and Lida on our wild cave tour and share it with all of our friends as well. As my research continued, sometimes I would just look through old newspapers that were on microfilm and look at the time frames of when Max Kaemper was here at Mammoth Cave. And it was kind of like shooting in the dark, but sometimes I would have success. And in the Glasgow newspaper from 1908, very small little article in the social and personal section, it talked about a party at Mammoth Cave where the people from Glasgow had made the trip to the cave, and there was a wonderful party at the Mammoth Cave Hotel on the outer deck, and that they brought the piano out, and that one of the local Glasgow citizens, a young woman by the name of Mamie Depp, played the piano, and she was accompanied by Max Kaemper from Berlin, Germany, on the violin. And just to find that in the newspaper was astounding, to make that connection. And then I realized that there is a passageway not too far from where I'm at right here that's called Mamie's Stoop. And so without a doubt, this young lady that Max played music with, and then when we found the journal, we could look in definitely and see that Mamie was with him inside the cave. So we were learning more about Max Kaemper. Now we knew that he was a very cultured man, that he played the violin. And I was able to track down descendants of Mamie Depp. And when the photographs came in, well, guess what? She was another very, very attractive, beautiful young woman. And so here Max is in the cave. He's kind of continuing with his, his theme of going into the cave with these lovely young ladies and showing them his discoveries. One thing I remember about interviewing a descendant of Mamie, the first thing I asked them, I said, "What can you tell me about your Aunt Mamie?" And they said she was very, very tall. She was about 5'10", and when you go through Mamie's Stoop, even today with a modern trail, you have to bend over and duck to get through. So before a trail system, Max and them would have been stooping over even more.
Chuck found a photograph taken in 1908 of two cave guides and a little girl.
On the back of the photograph, it had the name of the guides, and the name of the little girl was Dorothy Ranshaw. So I saw the last name Ranshaw and realized that there was a place on the Kaemper map called Ranshaw Avenue. And when I looked through the existing database and the files, I couldn't find any information on who Ranshaw was. So I thought this would be another fun one to investigate. And I started to look in the local directories, and I found that there were a lot of Ranshaws in the city of Covington, just across the river from Cincinnati, Ohio, in Covington, Kentucky. And so I eventually contacted and found myself on the phone with a nurse who was staying with an elderly woman who was Dorothy Ranshaw. And it turns out that it was the same lady who was in this photograph as a little girl. And she was 90 years old. At first, the phone calls were met with a little skepticism. You know, here's someone calling, a stranger, wanting to come up and maybe talk to this woman and do an interview. And they said that, Dorothy doesn't have any photographs. She really doesn't have anything to share, but we appreciate your call. So I thought, okay, I failed. I waited a little bit, to maybe another month, and called back and said, is there any chance, maybe you could talk to her? Maybe she does have some photographs. And they said, yeah, she's starting to become interested in your research. And they said, we'll get back in touch with you. And finally they called and said, yes, she would love to have you come and visit. And I went to her house. It was a beautiful, antique house in Covington, Kentucky. And she was all dressed up and had makeup and lipstick on. And the nurse said, oh, she's so excited that a young man is coming to call on her and to talk with her about her family. And she had these wonderful memories and a whole book of photographs. I mean, an entire book of photographs taken by her family while they were here at Mammoth Cave. And she allowed me to borrow the entire book of photos. And I wrote an article about it, and in the article I said that I smiled the whole drive home just after the encounter with Dorothy Ranshaw. It turns out her uncle was Dr. Willis Ranshaw, and he was a manager at the Mammoth Cave Hotel during the time frame that Max Kaemper would have been here. In fact, I believe there's a letter where Max actually goes to visit the Ranshaws and stays with them on his way back home after he has completed the map. So it was a lot of fun to meet and talk with Dorothy, and she passed away just a few months after I went up to do the interview. And it really struck me that, how time sensitive some of this research is, because a lot of these people were elderly, they were starting to fade away, and we barely got to it. In 1996, I had the privilege and the honor to take Dr. Stan Side's History of Exploration caving course. It's a week-long course offered through Western Kentucky University, Mammoth Cave National Park, and the Cave Research Foundation. And Dr. Sides is a legend when it comes to the history, especially the history of exploration at Mammoth Cave. And so I had never met Stan before that course, and I was telling him about some of the research I was doing with Becky and Lyda and working on the Ranshaws, and he was very excited. And at the end of the course, I remember Stan said, what you're doing on the Kaemper map is good research, but really we need to find Max Kaemper. We could study the map, we could try to find out who the people on his map are and their story, but the mystery of what happened to Max Kaemper was just looming over us. And even Stan agreed that if Max was going to be found, it would take someone to go to Germany. It was going to have to take someone who had the inside connections, knew the resources, and that was beyond what most of us were able to do.
Late in the summer of 1996, I was in my office at work, and a phone rings, and a gentleman with a German accent introduces himself as Bernd Kliebhan from Frankfurt, Germany, and that he has done a lot of research on E.A. Martel, the modern father of speleology in the Western world. Martel came to Mammoth Cave in 1912, and so he wanted to come to Mammoth Cave to see what we had, what he could learn about Martel's visit. And he had been referred to me by Phil de Blasi, the president of the Cave Research Foundation. So I got his phone number. I said, well, I will ask and see what I can do. So I went to my boss, Jeff Bradybaugh, the chief of science and resource, and I explained the situation to him. And to my surprise, he said, well, it don't take more than 2 or 3 days. Well, I was very delighted to hear this, called Bernd back, we set a date. And of course, immediately I called Chuck DeCroix because we have a German researcher. So finally the day comes, and Bernd calls from Cave City. I went down to pick him up, and I asked him, I said, have he had heard of this man, Max Kaemper? And he says, no, I do not know this man, Max Kaemper. And I said, well, we'll be talking to you about him fairly extensively. So for the next 3 days, Chuck and I showed Bernd around the cave, took him, of course, to Martel Avenue, went to places that Chuck knew where there were Kaemper signatures, and of course we laid it on very thick finally to the point where Bernd got exasperated and said, yes, yes, I will look for this man, Max Kaemper.
I remember very well. We came to this point and they showed me these inscriptions and pointed me out one special. It's MK, which stands for Max Kaemper. And they showed me the map of Max Kaemper. And I was very impressed. I didn't know anything about Max Kaemper before. And they knew a lot about all these people except about Max Kaemper. And they asked me, couldn't you find out for us who Max Kaemper was? And you are a journalist, you are interested in caves, you are a German, so should work. And I said, okay, I will try my very best. And at home I tried to get, to dig into the archives. But the difficulty was 2 world wars had really wiped out nearly everything.
So he went back to Germany, and he and his wife Nina did their best, but of course with 2 world wars it's very difficult, and the trail was pretty cold.
Many archives got lost, and I couldn't find any place where to start. I wrote letters to everybody with the name Kaemper in Berlin. I got some very friendly answers, but nobody with the name Kaemper in Berlin had something to do with Max Kaemper. Oh, it was like caving. Finally did the research. You go out some way and it's a dead end, and you try another way, it's a dead end as well. Fortunately, the address books of Berlin from that time survived. And at that time they were not available online in the internet. So I had to check out all the archives. I had to go to the libraries, the archives, copy the pages which might be interesting for me, and do analysis. And it became quite clear that Max Kaemper died during the First World War. I found the address of Max Kaemper before the First World War, about 1910. And in the address book of 1920, there was a widow Kaemper, and it was obviously his widow. Finally, I could persuade the director of the Berlin archives that this is a big story, and we had to find the answer. And so he said, I will give you my best man to do this research. And this was Mr. Lucke. Mr. Lucke was a specialist for military history. And Max had something to do with military, because he named one of his discoveries Moltke Dome. Moltke was a general in the Prussian army. And really, Mr. Lucke found the obituary of Hugo Kaemper, of the general. And the most important sentence was, his only son Max died in the Battle of the Somme. So I knew now who Max was. And in the obituary there were as well the names of the widow and of 3 children. And it was a lot of good luck. Finally I found the Max Kaemper's son Hans, got his telephone number, called him up. And it was the voice of a very old man. And he said, oh, you are interested in my father?
Ich war mit dem Hund spazieren. Hans lag noch im Bett und an einem Sonntagmorgen.
I was out with the dog. Hans was still in bed on this Sunday morning. When I came back, he said, there was a telephone call, very strange. The person shouted, we found him! And I hung up. After a while, there was the next call from Mr. Kliebhan, who wanted to know if he was the son of Max Kaemper. He was very happy that he had found the descendants after a long search. Shortly later, Mr. Kliebhan came here, and then we learned to know about the whole story, which now belongs to the family.
Next weekend we were there in their home in southern Germany, me and Nina, my wife, who had shared the passion for this research.
We knew he had been in America, but we did not know about the importance of his journey.
The family knew that Max had been in America, and they knew as well that he had something to do with the cave. But they had any idea that he was such a celebrity, such an important person for American cavers.
Hans was 4 years old when his father died. When his father came home, he did not tell a lot, but he kept the photographs somewhere in his cellar for future use. And for sure, he would have traveled to America again, but it happened differently.
They could give me information about his person, why he went to America, all this. And then there came the big surprise. Max's widow was very old. She died nearly 100 years old. And she had kept memories, reliquie, like of Max in a black box. And when I came, they pulled it out and gave it to me, and I opened it. And the first thing I saw were the pictures of Max had taken in Violet City with magnesium power. Nice pictures. And many more pictures from, and maps, reproduction of some maps he did. And the most fascinating thing, a little notebook, a little black notebook. And with this notebook, it was possible to trace down very precisely what he did, at what time, in what city, what he did in New York and in Philadelphia, and finally here in Mammoth Cave.
So then, by 1998, Bernd had indeed found the family. And so he came back to Mammoth Cave, and he was able to show us the entire story of much of Max's life, and then, of course, his involvement in World War I. And Max was a photographer, not just here at Mammoth Cave, but he was quite the photographer. He took lots of pictures, including the very sad last one where he's standing in this trench and he's looking very haggard. And there was a lot of dissonance in us because Max is part of us. He's our friend, but here he is wearing this German helmet, which is the enemy, and so we're torn to pieces. But basically, the idea of his loss, of him being killed at the Battle of the Somme, there wasn't a dry eye in the room, I can tell you.
Max kept a diary that's been essential to us learning what he did when he arrived in New York City. He came on May 16th, 1907, and commented about the thunderstorm. He stayed at a hotel on southern Manhattan Island at 4th and 18th, the Hotel Belvedere. Later, he returned there before he then, almost a year later, returned to Germany. He did not like the teeming immigrant community he found of Italian and German immigrants that were pouring into New York City at that time. He stayed about several days Hotel Belvedere, but by 9 days later, he rented a rooming house a little bit further away, a little bit further north in New York City, into a slightly better area of New York City. And on June 3rd, 1907, he interviewed at Lidgerwood Hoisting Engines. This is a company that made cable stayways as well as steam-driven elevators used in construction. He interviewed on June 3rd, and on June 6th, he began working for Lidgerwood Hoisting Engines for $16 a week. He apparently enjoyed his time at Lidgerwood, and he continued to work there until just before Thanksgiving of 1907. His salary was increased to $18 shortly after he began working there. At first, his letters reflected he thought the Americans were uncouth, especially their eating habits. He did not like this immigrant community of all of these people coming in the area. But you see him beginning to adjust a little bit to his love of the arts. And on July 1st, his diary reflects that he began violin lessons with Frau Schwinde. And the rest of his time he's in New York City, he commonly refers to Frau Schwinde and taking violin lessons from her. Through the summer, he starts going to a famed cemetery in Brooklyn, and he walked over the Brooklyn Bridge, and he commented about that. Not far away was Coney Island, an amusement park, and he went there. He began taking trips up into northern New York, but basically stayed in the New York area. He continued his work at Lidgerwood Hoisting Engines, and by fall started moving further up into New York City, into Manhattan Island, away from the packed tenements in southern Manhattan. And you can see that there was a transition. At first, he didn't like the cultures he found, but it seems that as he began becoming more comfortable with English, he began going to the Metropolitan Opera. He recorded, he heard Caruso. He went to plays, and before he left, he and a young woman, Miss Liggins, apparently went to a fair number of places together, because he would comment in his notes about her accompanying him. He finally told Lidgerwood Hoisting Engines that he was going to quit the day before the Thanksgiving holiday in 1907. With that, he continued to take lessons and explored the area. Of note is that he never went to caves. In New York, any of the places around New York City, Pennsylvania, he never, West Virginia. When you read his diary, there's no obvious interest in caves at that time. The arts clearly became much more important, and friends, German friends from the far northern part of Manhattan Island at a place, Inwood, he would visit them on their farm very frequently. He finally said goodbye to them the end of January and began his trek by railroad that took him looking at steel producing factories in the United States, ultimately bringing him to Mammoth Cave. I think the things we learned from his diary is that as he learned English, as he became more familiar with the United States and New York City, as he moved to better areas in the city and developed a lot of friends, that he began to feel much more comfortable with the American culture and especially the arts. It's clear he was deeply involved in the arts in New York City until he left that area. Returning then the following November back to the Hotel Belvedere, where he stayed a short period of time before then he left for Germany in December 1908.
Max Kaemper arrived here at Mammoth Cave in February of 1908. And at that point, he was a simple visitor. He was a tourist. And he did what all tourists would do. He took the regular standard tours of Mammoth Cave. He also took a tour of Colossal Cave, and he went to Dixon Cave. He was buying postcards and he was taking pictures. But at some point, he began to pay for the services of Ed Bishop, and he began to explore and even do some mapping on his own. And that is really impressive, because at this point, he does not have official permission to map the cave. So he's just kind of doing it on his own. But we know that in March, he had already found a new part of the cave that he called Goethe's Grotto. And then in April, the word was spreading about this young German who was making all these marvelous discoveries. And in April, he was able to secure a deal with Judge Albert Covington Janin, one of the owners of the cave, that he could stay here. They would put him up at the Mammoth Cave Hotel with free lodging, free food, and probably most importantly, free caving. But once Max Kaemper got his permission, it was clear that he was going to need one of the best, most talented, rugged, hardy cave guides that was on the staff. And at that time, without a doubt, the main man was Mr. Ed Bishop. Ed and the Bishop family have quite the legacy at Mammoth Cave. Ed is the grandnephew of the famous cave guide and explorer Stephen Bishop, who also put together an early map of Mammoth Cave back in the 1840s. We have a lot of photographs of Ed Bishop, and when you look at the photographs, you can just tell this guy was tough. He was a caver. But clearly from Max Kaemper's journal, he was very impressed with Ed Bishop. He was tipping him in the early days. He mentions his name several times. At one point, there's an entry for Ed Bishop. He gives him some money for stick and string, which we believe is surveying instruments that they would have used to make this map. Several places were named in the cave on the Kaemper map after Ed Bishop, and also after Ed's children. And to spend 8 months together, I'm sure that they became quite an effective team to map this 36-mile wonderful piece of art. Where we're at right here, this is a feature in the cave called Ultima Thule. And it was considered the end of the cave for all cave tours up until 1908. But Max and Ed, as they were surveying in this area, noticed that they could hear a little bit of water coming from beyond the breakdown. They began to look in the breakdown and found some passageways and began to worm their way through. The water became stronger. Eventually they moved some rocks and pushed onward. The description even has a rock falling, a piece of breakdown falling and pinning Max Kaemper by his neck temporarily. But he was able to free himself, move the rock, and continue onward. So I think that shows you just how brave these men were as they were exploring. And their exploration, their bravery paid off because they would make a huge discovery of chambers that no one had ever seen on the other side. There was Bishop's Pit, named, that was the source of the water. Kaemper Hall, huge chamber, named after Max or the Kaemper family. There was Elizabeth's Dome that he named after his sister who was back home in Germany. And then Violet City, who was named after Violet Blair Janin, who was the wife of Judge Albert Covington Janin. And even the stone stairway that was eventually built with Max Kaemper's help and probably his engineering was named Albert's Stairway, after the man who had given him permission to go through. When this discovery was made, Judge Janin actually came here, and again, this is well documented, that to get him through the breakdown, he had to lay flat on his back. The guides would grab him by his boots and they would pull him through the breakdown with rocks all over him. He said it was very scary, very dangerous. So at that point he knew they would have to find a way to engineer and make a trail to go through Ultima Thule so these new discoveries could be seen by the public. And they did that very quickly, and I'm sure that Max Kaemper was involved with surveying that trail to get into that area. In addition to this, Max continued to explore and find many new places that had never been seen before. Another huge discovery on his map is what he called Grand Avenue. And today it's mainly known by Kentucky Avenue, but it is one of the longest known continuous passageways in the Mammoth Cave system. It just stretches on for miles, huge, big canyons. And to think about Max and Ed mapping and surveying in these huge passageways with their lard oil lanterns and candles and their primitive but effective tools and instruments is really spectacular.
I was puzzled always by how Max could map 36 miles or more of cave in only 8 months, have time to reduce the data, draft the map, and socialize. This is an astounding rate, and the map is quite accurate too. So how could he achieve this kind of quality in that amount of time?
One thing that always impressed me, especially from those early days, is the fact that Kaemper did all that work with only one entrance. And when you think about how do I get to this remote location on this end of the map when the entrance is all the way over here, and it's like a maze, a puzzle to wind through the cave and all the different colored passageways, and some go over the top of each other but they don't connect. And you think about the labyrinth of passageways to make these discoveries and then to map the cave always was very impressive.
everybody seemed to be of the opinion that Max paced the distances in the cave instead of measured them. And when you look at how rugged the terrain is in a cave with breakdown and so forth, pacing just isn't going to give you the level of precision that's really, really needed. This was based on a Horace Hovey paper from 1909 in Scientific American, but in that same paper, here we are, he came to see the new discovery here in Violet City, and of course the rooms are huge, and he said, by the survey tape, the room is this big by that big, and I go, aha, the survey tape, you know, no pacing over this great big hole to try to get a distance, and so I think that was, I think we've turned the corner on that, and people are no longer saying that Max Kaemper paced the distances in the cave. Certainly in the crawlways that he mapped, you cannot pace that. Had to have some way of measuring it. The next big event was the International Congress of Speleology in Texas, which was in the summer of 2009. And I met Dr. Dieter Mucke, who's a geologist from Germany. And of course, as always, you meet anyone from Germany, you always wind up talking about Max Kaemper. Well, he was very interested in this story. Dr. Mucke said that at the Deutsche Museum, they had extensive displays on underground survey and that the Germans were quite good at this. So now Bernd had been inviting us to come to Germany for years and years. And we thought, well, maybe this is a good time. So in September, we flew into Frankfurt, and we were treated absolutely like royalty, spoiled rotten, and enjoyed every second of it. And one of the things we did was go to the Deutsche Museum, where you could see that they had these string-mounted instruments. The compass had a rather large dial to it, and so therefore it could be read very precisely, and there was no question about the compass being in line with the stations. One end of the string is on one station and the other one's on the other. I found a book by that was owned by Stan Sides on mine survey in the United States, and it showed a hanging compass almost identical to the one in the Deutsche Museum, but it was made by Kufel and Esser in Manhattan, New York, 2 blocks from where Max used to live in Manhattan. And I thought, wow. But of course, Max gave no record of buying such an instrument, so he probably already had something with him because he wrote down everything he bought. I wrote to Bernd, I said, Bernd, can you please possibly find a hanging compass, you know? And he wrote back almost instantly, he says, it's on its way. And it's very nice. And so what was even sweeter about it is that it was an artillery compass. Well, Max was trained in the artillery. So he was almost certainly trained on this exact kind of instrument. And so here we are, May 2018, Bernd brings the compass, and today we are doing tests. And the other day with Stan Sides, they did a side-by-side comparison with the Disto X, Sunto, and the compass from Freiburg. What's the name of the? Hildebrand compass from Freiburg.
At some point, Max begins to realize that he's running out of time. You know, he had been here for 8 months. So, you know, at some point he had to get home to Germany. He had to wrap everything up. He had to complete the map, drop it off to Violet and Albert, and then go back to Germany. And then that's where the big mystery began, because after he left, no word was heard back from him, very little information, but it took Bernd Kliebhan to really take the research to a new level to go back to Germany and find what happened to Max Kaemper.
There was one big question where we could not easily find an answer. Why came Max to Mammoth Cave? So he had never anything to do with caves before, as far as we know. And January 1908, so why should a German tourist go to Mammoth Cave at that time?
And again, unexpected good luck comes to help. In 1997, the speleo historian Hans Binder publishes an article about the German engineer Max Eyt and his map of Mammoth Cave in 1866. Hans Binder did not know anything about the ongoing research about Max Kaemper, and he could not envision that his paper gave the key to the question, what could have caused Max Kaemper to undertake this journey to Kentucky.
Max Eid was, for the young engineers at the turn of the century, sort of an ideal person.
Max Eid was an engineer, writer, and poet, reporting in his books about his travels to foreign countries. In 1871, Travel Book of an Engineer was published, in which he described how he celebrated Christmas in Mammoth Cave. During this visit, he drew some nice watercolors and did a survey of the galleries he had seen. Such a survey was risky and strictly forbidden at the time, because the cave owners feared that the cave might reach far beyond the borders of their land. In 1904, a new edition of his travel adventures was published under the title In the Current of Our Time. The book became quite popular among young engineers at the turn of the century.
Probably Max Kaemper knew these books of Max Eid. And I asked the family again, and the family had a look in their library, and really Max Eid's book, where he described how he went to Mammoth Cave for Christmas, was in the library. So I think when Max left New York, it was on the traces of Max Eid. He had read these nice things of Max Eid and thought, oh yeah, Mammoth Cave, Max Eid went there, it was a good idea, I will go there as well. And probably he had the idea to go on to New Orleans and other places which Max Eid had visited. But when he arrived here, and he had the idea to stay here for 2 or 3 days, he was fascinated, and we all know the rest of the story.
Then the next big event was when the Kaemper family came to Mammoth Cave in the year 2000 for an entire week. And so that was just really something.
Ein großes Erlebnis war das.
It was a great experience. I went there with all my children. It was good that we did this together. We had a very friendly reception. We were VIPs and they showed us everything. This was a new experience for us. The visit of the cave was something special.
Und dann der Besuch in der Höhle, der war natürlich also was ganz Besonderes.
In 2000, several members of the Kaemper family came to visit, and one of the things that we did was take them into various parts of the cave that they wouldn't get into if they were on a regular tour.
It was a wonderful experience. I had no idea about caves before. I did not know if I might be afraid or claustrophobic. I could understand my grandfather when he walked around down there, far away from the world. It was a spiritual experience.
Das ist auch wirklich eine spirituelle Erfahrung.
He was so in love with Mammoth Cave. We would go down a passage, and all of a sudden Klaus would be gone, and I didn't know where he'd gone. And basically, I was kind of in charge of what he was doing. And I would look up on a ledge, and there would be Klaus sitting up there in the dark, just sitting there, just enjoying the silence of the cave. And that was one of the things that he did comment to me about, was the silence of the cave. He loved how silent it was.
You hear nothing except dripping water somewhere far away. An absolute silence, what you never experience in normal life. You are absolutely isolated from the outside world. This was probably the experience Max Kaemper had with Ed Bishop. A very different, a very special world.
And they did want to see Pilgrim Avenue, and there are steps down into this area off of the regular cave tour. So most of the group went down the steps. But Klaus decided that he didn't want to do the steps. He wanted to do the climb down, which is right behind me here. And since I was a wild cave guide, I could get him down that way easily. So we came down that way and the others came down the steps. And we came down into Pilgrim Avenue. And for those of us who were guides at Mammoth Cave, we didn't know the significance of the name Pilgrim. We just did not know that, and the family told us that that was a family name, that this was a part of their family, and that was wonderful to find out. So we took them back and showed them that whole area, showed them names and that sort of thing, which I think we'll do later. But the interesting thing was then when we went back out, Klaus decided that he wanted to do the climb up. He did not want to go up the steps with everyone else. So he and I did the climb up. Then somebody decided that they wanted to take his picture on the climb. So then he had to climb down again and climb back up so they could get his photograph on that.
We went all over the cave and we had a wonderful social at Janet Bass-Smith's home where she had a cello.
The evening after we had gone into the cave, I invited the entire group to come to my home in Bowling Green to have a meal and just to be a social gathering. Well, when we got there, Klaus discovered that I had a cello. I'm a cello player as well. And he and I decided that we would play cello and piano together.
Also ist ja schon mal überraschend, dass eine der Höhlenführerinnen.
It was a surprise that one of the cave guides was such an excellent pianist. We found out that we both were musicians. Janet invited us to a social gathering in her home. This was a great surprise for us. She had an old cello and we played the Swan and a Vivaldi sonata. There were many guests doing some performances. One told stories, very impressive, and others recited poems. We were enthusiastic about the culture.
We had never played together. We had never seen each other before. And we started playing together and it was magical. He would understand what I was going to do and I the same way. If he took a nuance, I would also do that and vice versa. We had the very best time that night performing together.
I remember sitting in the living room and just sitting in front of Klaus, and he was playing the cello, and suddenly just tears started coming out of my eyes. That never happened before. It was just amazing. So then finally, everybody went back home. Didn't see anybody until 2007 when Ulrika and her husband Gerd were in the country because Gerd his company has business partners here. So they decided to come by. We had an ice cream social at the house. And Ulrika just mentioned, she says, next year will be the 100th anniversary of Max being here. And we all kind of had that deer in the headlights look and we go, you're right, we got to do something with that. And so we did. We had a big symposium mostly focused on Max Kaemper, lots of history papers and so forth, and of course this outstanding concert in the cave with Dr. Janet Bass-Smith and Klaus Kaemper, Klaus on the cello, of course.
I think it was the Cave Research Foundation that decided that they were going to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Max Kaemper mapping the cave. And so 2008, in October, we decided that we would have a concert in the cave. First, Klaus decided he'd bring his string quartet that he's a member of, and we decided that wasn't going to work. And then he decided, well, maybe he could play with someone else, and then he suggested maybe the two of us could give a concert in the cave. And I agreed to that immediately.
We had the idea that we could give a concert in the cave. It happened 8 years later in 2008 in this wonderful hall. That's an unforgettable experience.
We're here to celebrate the life of a man named Max Kaemper. He came here from Berlin, Germany, 100 years ago. And maybe he came to Mammoth Cave just like a lot of you folks, as a visitor. But once he went inside the cave, he was captivated. And he knew that something was calling him, beckoning him inside the cave. His stay of a few days and maybe up to a week would turn into 8 months. And over this 8-month stay, he would map and explore and produce a map that has become legendary within the last 100 years, simply known as the Kaemper map. Members of the Kaemper family have traveled across the ocean to come back to Mammoth Cave, Kentucky. They're with us here today. The grandson of Max Kaemper, a man named Klaus, will be playing the cello, and our own cave guide and wild caver, a pianist named Janet Bass Smith, will be performing in the Methodist Church. If you would please, follow me.
And the first thing he decided he wanted to play was the Brahms cello sonata. He loved to play Bach, so he decided to do that, and then I decided to do Fireworks by Debussy because I knew Chuck DeCroix loves that piece. So that was my solo piece. Trying to find the things that Max might have played, because Max played violin and he played with a pianist when he stayed at the Mammoth Cave Hotel. So we were trying to find things that might have been performed during that period.
The next one is the Melody in F, which we found. I saw it yesterday in the diary of my grandfather, that he bought it in New York, but we had not to go so far. Chuck found it in the internet and printed it out for us.
We found the music, and my husband, who is a composer, he arranged that for cello and piano, and we played that.
We played Brahms, Bach, and Schubert, and as an encore, the national anthem of Kentucky. The audience, which was standing around us, started humming the melody. This was an unforgettable moment.
Und das ist einfach ein Erlebnis, was man als Musiker auch nicht vergisst.
We had rehearsed twice, and we're playing Brahms and some other difficult things. It was amazing. We were able to play this music, which is very difficult for both performers, in a way that it was as if we had performed together for years. I think that was one of the highlights of my career as a concert pianist. I have toured Europe. I have played a concerto with an orchestra in St. Petersburg, Russia. But this concert inside Mammoth Cave, I think, was the highlight of my very long career as a concert pianist.
The story of the Kaemper map does not end here. The original map is safely kept in the archives of the National Park, but for researchers, it is still available after digital restoration.
I realized if we don't do something in fairly short order time is going to erase the Kaemper map. Not only that, but our understanding of how to take care of archival materials has changed over the last 20 to 30 years. There was a time back in the late 70s, early 80s, when it was considered acceptable to take an archival document like a map and encase it inside of plastic in a permanent way. Well, now we would never consider doing that because you can't get it out to do something more preservative to it. If we were to try to take the, and this was done with the Kaemper map, if you were to try to take the Kaemper map out of its encasement now, it would probably turn to dust. So the Kaemper map, the original, as we have it now, is as we have it. And whatever is going to happen to it inside that plastic casing is going to happen. So whatever light is going to do to it in terms of its effect on those pigments is going to happen. And there's nothing we can do. Except there is something we can do. I realized we can take the information that is still available to us in the Kaemper map and we can preserve it. Not only can we preserve it, we can enhance it using digital techniques. So I realized that I was in a position, because I'm the visual information specialist at Mammoth Cave and I have access to the Kaemper map, I could take the equipment at hand and my access to the map, I could scan it at a very high resolution and I could use software to not only capture the map at a point in time, but I could use science, use mathematics to interpolate the data that was received and basically turn back the clock in a way to restore the information that was in the map, to restore the map without touching it, without doing any damage whatsoever to the map. So it seemed to me I could meet the demands of those who needed the map and at the same time preserve the map for another century to come so that no one would ever have to go to that map and pull it out into the light where light could strike it and fade those colors again. So it would never have to be rolled up, God help it, as it had been done in the past and carried off from one place to the other. So we could preserve the original for as long as possible and yet still have the best original digitally to use for research and study well into the future. I never wanted to make anything new. I was so determined that everything I did was based on mathematics, was based on careful observation, so that no one could say at the end of the day, Trace Seymour created the new Kaemper map. What I want someone to say is Max Kaemper created a map that endured into the 21st century. And at the very, very most, that Trace Seymour held a light while he worked. That's what I want to know. That's what I would like there to be. This is Max Kaemper's map, and it is as close and as faithful a reproduction of his map that I was able to produce. Max Kaemper's colors on the map, as you look at it today, are not the colors that he put, not the ink colors that he put down. Time has changed that. If you look at the paper is a tan color. He didn't do his work on tan paper. That paper has faded over time. It has aged. So has the ink. The ink has changed color. Obviously the green has faded away almost completely. I tried to take the scans and make certain assumptions about color. If light has caused paper to change color at a certain rate, has caused the histogram of that color to alter at in a certain way, then the histogram of the ink will have altered in a similar fashion. So if I change the histogram of the paper in such a way that it turns white, and I apply the same process to the ink, then I will at least have changed everything in a similar way, so that I will at least approximate some sense of how that ink would have looked if the paper were white. So that's what I chose to do. And the inks that you see on the restored Kaemper map reflect that. Whether they are true to Kaemper's original inks, I can't say for certain. I'm not an expert in the inks of 1908. But I can tell you that that process produced a green that is fairly robust. So it wasn't an odd-looking green, it wasn't a fluorescent green, it was a kind of green that one might have expected someone to use to draw a map with. I did also look at the methods by which lines were drawn. This was a bit of a tricky question for me, and I spent a lot of time agonizing over how to do this. How to reproduce the lines that Kaemper created. I could scan that map, and using the power of Photoshop, I could isolate those lines down to a certain point, and they would have pixelation around them, a certain jagged area. I could smooth that out, and it would create a line with a certain fidelity to the original, but sometimes it would not be, to the eye, quite what you would expect to see when you looked at the original. Sometimes you'd get a mottled appearance. I could then take basically a digital stylus, and selecting the colors that I had created, carefully draw over that selected area and smooth it out to carefully approximate the line that Kaemper had drawn, and come up with aesthetically something that more closely resembled Max Kaemper's original line. That was not a mathematical selection. That was art more than science. And I had a really difficult time deciding, should this be a process of art or should it be a process of science? Should I let the computers do all the work, or should I manually recreate his lines? In the end, I elected to let the computer guide my art. And I guess I will always be a little bit uncertain whether I've made the proper decision, but Max Kaemper's map was not a computer-generated map. It was the work of a man's hand. And I can never be quite certain that my hand did not slip in following his lines precisely, but I have done my best to not create anything new, but to give both the precision and the spirit of what he attempted, what he succeeded in creating for the world. In my estimation, a computer would have produced, left to its own devices, would have produced something without soul. There's a section of the data that I've saved and in the files that I've distributed for the public, which I call the anomaly layer. In the scans, when I would enhance them, and by the way, as a part of my process, I I would take the original scan data and then I would posterize it, which means I would take the entire, like, millions of colors of data and would reduce them down to 12 colors. Let the computer subset all of that down, which would basically average out and select nearest neighbor colors down. And it would suddenly things would begin, and then I would begin to delete them. Delete this color, all of this color, and all of that color. And then suddenly things would begin to pop out that were not readily visible to the naked eye, but structures would appear. And I began to realize they were the structures of his pencil. There were radial lines that went around like plot lines, as though he were drawing his passageways using some sort of polar coordinates. There were also very obvious places along the cave passageways where there were sight lines. Point, line, point, line, point, line, point, line. It was absolutely obvious what he was doing. There were places where you could see names. Ellen's Grotto, that he had drawn by hand. It's his handwriting. That had been drawn and then erased, but not fully erased. And most intriguing of all, there are places where there are outlines of passageways that are not implemented in the maps themselves, which leaves you to wonder, did he start to draw something on the map and then realize it was in the wrong place? Or did he draw something that he wasn't sure about? Or is it just a mystery? Those are things that I've left that information in the map data so that people can explore further. This is Max Kaemper, 3/6/1908, March 6, 1908. He stood right here and scratched his name on the wall. Being in Pilgrim Avenue, it's kind of interesting because it makes me think of this that I brought with me. John Bunyan, in the 1600s, I think it was, wrote a hymn called The Pilgrim about courage. It goes, "Who would true valor see, let him come hither. One here will constant be, come wind, come weather. There's no discouragement shall make him once relent his first vowed intent to be a pilgrim."
That's fantastic.
Max Kaemper had no discouragement in a place like this. The next verse says something about who so beset him round with dismal stories, but they do but themselves confound, his strength the more is. What he must have been told about the cave and the dismal stories here, he was not daunted by it. He came down here and explored and found and mapped and gave it all to us. And if I could help bring what he shared with us forward, then I'm glad to have done that.
Und es ist ja nur so traurig, dass man...
It's sad when we think about what would have happened if Max Kaemper had survived the war and not have fallen so young. The family only has the tales.